This is the Future Christian Podcast, a conversation about church leadership, fresh ideas, and the future of the church. Welcome to the Future Christian Podcast. Today, Loren Richmond Jr. is in conversation with Kris and Larry Doornbos. Kris is the campus pastor of a church restart in Lake Worth, Florida, that is part of Sunlight Community Church campuses of South Florida. He is also the director of the Center for Church Renewal. Previously, he spent 20 years leading a church plant, Crossroads Community Church, in Indiana. On his journey of church planting, he spent time learning from and training other church planters. Currently in the work of renewal, he has come alongside other renewal leaders. His greatest passion is building relationships with people who don't know Christ. He is married to Deborah, and together they have 4 children and 4 grandchildren. Larry loves and is committed to the local church. He is an experienced pastor, church planter, and leader. He began his ministry in New Mexico. In 1993, Larry, along with a core group of 7 families, began Evergreen Ministries in Michigan. Evergreen is an outward-facing church that serves its community and the world. Larry served as director of Vibrant Congregations, helping congregations discover their God-given, hope-filled future. Presently, he is president of Imagine Church and director of the New Horizons Project. In his free time, Larry loves hanging out with his wife, Linda, professor at Oakland University, exploring cities, and viewing British TV. He also works out, but he does not enjoy that at all. Linda and Larry have 2 children, Gail, a professor at Dordt University, and Kris, a special needs young man who inspires many. A reminder before we start today's conversation. Please take a moment to subscribe to the podcast, leave a review, and share Future Christian with a friend. Connect with Loren, Martha, and Future Christian on Instagram. Shoot us an email at loren@resonatemediapro.com with comments, questions, or ideas for future episodes. Your support and voice mean a lot to us in making this independent podcast possible.
I suppose since there's 2 of you, it'll work how you look on my screen. So, Kris, you're just to my side. So, Kris, let's begin with you. Share kind of about your journey of faith, what that looked like in the past and what that looks like today.
Yeah, it really started for me in early adolescence with a loneliness. I was really felt isolated. I had a severe case of acne that made me feel kind of like a leper among my peers. And through my parents, their faithfulness and their brokenness, I discovered a friendship in God. And that really transformed my future and my life. And yeah, currently, I think you asked about spiritual practices. I think one of the things that I've added to my spiritual routine is listening to the Psalms set to music. And that's really been a great growing thing for me in my spiritual life. So,
Yeah. Thanks for sharing that. Larry, how about you?
Yeah, I was blessed to be raised in a pastor's home. And so I'm a pastor's kid and walked that pathway of faith with a family that managed to do that balance of being kind of in the fishbowl and at the same time allowing us freedom to be who we were. And so really thankful for that upbringing in the faith. And when I think a little bit about spiritual practices, mine constantly shift. And so at certain times I'm deeply into prayer, other times I'm deeply into the scriptures and just all the different practices. And I'm a person who kind of needs that shift to kind of keep things kind of fresh and alive for me. And right now I've just started doing a read through the Bible using the Bible Project materials. And so, yeah, just that whole flavor of movement and so on in my spiritual life.
Awesome. Thanks for sharing all that. So let's begin the conversation with this, actually. I'm thinking, Larry and Kris, you'll have to correct me here or clarify, but they come from the Christian Reformed Church and the Reformed Church of America, or at least those are the contexts you both work within. So for our listeners maybe who are unfamiliar with those contexts, those traditions. Larry, can you just share a little bit about those traditions?
Sure. So the Reformed Church in America is actually the oldest denomination, Protestant denomination in the United States. And so if you go to the West Coast or to the East Coast, you'll find churches that have a history of more than 400 years. And we've had the joy of working with some of those churches along the way. And the Christian Reformed Church is actually kind of an offshoot of the RCA in the 1800s, late 1800s. And Kris and I have been part of the Church Reformed Church that whole time. I'm now an RCA pastor. But there's a lot of similarities between the two denominations, and we get to serve those denominations, but also through part of our project, we also serve non-denominational churches and Pentecostal churches.
Yeah. Kris, I have to ask this as someone who this podcast and myself, we are primarily situated within like the mainline tradition in America. And this is a question that I always ask folks, like I ask about folks who I know who are like LCMS, Lutheran Church Missouri Synod. Same question, like does the RCA and CRC consider themselves part of the mainline?
Well, that's a great question, and I think one we're continually wrestling with.
Yeah.
We like to see ourselves both in the mainline tradition as well as in the evangelical camp. So, yeah, we like to ride the fence on that particular issue.
Yeah, fair enough. Fair enough. I was just reading a book by a United Methodist author. Hopefully, it'll be on the podcast soon. Lovett Weems. He talks about how Methodism really, in many ways, should be seen as sort of, I think, a both and, like you said there.
Yeah.
Well, let's talk about this. I somehow came across y'all's work and thought this would make for an interesting conversation. This is a podcast where I'm always interested. Martha and I are interested in the future of the church and what's happening to seek revitalization, renewal. So I guess begin by talking about the center where y'all work, where you're all a part of, kind of how that came to be and what that emphasis is on now.
Yeah. I'll start with my own journey there. Actually, Keith Doornbos, Larry's brother, is our founder, and he's still on our teaching team, though he's retired. But I kind of came to the whole journey not willingly. I was a church planter for 20 years, and God really blessed that church plant in Northwest Indiana where I was at. And I had a little bit of that arrogant edge of church planters that they sometimes have, and kind of
Never.
and kind of bought into that saying that we like to say in church planting, it's easier to give birth than it is to raise the dead.
Yeah.
And then God called me to a renewal work, really a replant here in South Florida. And then Keith and Larry invited me into the teaching team for what we call the Renewal Lab. That's kind of our flagship ministry of the Center for Church Renewal. And I began to see pastors and leaders who were really passionate and missional and wanted to see renewal in their churches. And as we began to teach some of the principles that we do in the Renewal Lab, they were just eating it up and working in every way possible to apply these principles in their local setting. And my heart just was moved to say there are so many churches and so many local pastors out there that need encouragement, that need some guidance and some coaching along the way in the very difficult journey of church renewal. And that just really moved my heart to be a part of it. And eventually God positions things so that I'm now the director of the Center for Church Renewal, and it's been a blessing for me to be a part of it for the last 2 years. Larry maybe can give you a little bit more of the early beginnings.
Yeah, great.
So we started in about 2013. I was working at the time for something called Christian Reformed Home Missions, and my brother was beginning this journey, and we began to think about what's it look like to create churches that follow a renewal pathway and make their way towards a healthier future. And so we worked on that together about 2013, 2014. When we began, we were connected to Calvin Theological Seminary in Grand Rapids. and were there for a few years, and then became an independent organization under what's called 222 Multiply. And so we've served about 120 churches and over 1,000 leaders over the years we've been together. And it's just been a great journey. We work with wonderful people. And kind of our big move right now is we're working with Native American congregations and Latino congregations in Renewal. And we have groups in Michigan, Florida, Los Angeles, and New Mexico.
So, Larry, I'm curious, like, my hunch is that regardless of the context or regardless of the tradition or denomination in America, especially amongst like predominantly white congregations, like I imagine many of the challenges are the same. And I'm curious, is that suspicion accurate regardless of tradition?
I think it is. So as we've gone through this journey, we talk about the big three and the hidden one when it comes to almost all churches we work with. And so the big three are most churches lack either a vision or a calling. They lack a discipleship pathway, and they haven't figured out how to bridge people from their community back into the life of their congregation. And then we talk about a hidden one, which is what's the culture of the church? Because culture will destroy almost everything else that you find through a renewal process.
Yeah.
And so right. So we found that along the way, that really when we start talking to congregations and work with them, that it's these big three things that they need to focus in on, and then also discover the culture of their church, which is either blocking the way of the renewal journey or giving them health towards that renewal journey.
What was that third one you said?
The third one is connecting people from their community back into the life of the congregation.
Tell me more about that.
So what we find often is churches do a really good job, if you will think about a bridge, that they bridge to their community through all kinds of things. They have a food pantry, they do vacation Bible school, they have some events or something like that, right? But they've not figured out how do we take that bridge and not only go this way, but have it come back this way so that people become part of the life of the congregation. And so that's the really difficult thing. Most congregations do a really great job of doing things in their community, but they never figured out how do we actually build the relationships and the connections that move those people from where they were into the life of the congregation and into faith.
Let's stay on this for a moment, Kris, because I find this, I'm definitely seeing this or recognizing this trend too, because obviously people understand, broadly speaking, a lacking of vision. Most people, I think, understand lacking discipleship. And I think anybody who's tried to lead a church, an unhealthy church, understands how much culture can make or break your efforts. But this, I'm intrigued by this point about, if I'm thinking about it visually of like you said, the bridge back to the church, because tons of churches will do lots of stuff for outreach, but certainly depending on the context. I mean, there is certainly, I want to acknowledge within some traditions, they might even have some angst. Like, I'll just be frank, in some of the conversations I have with different church leaders in different contexts, there might be some angst about expecting any kind of return or folks to come from the community. But what have you seen? How have you helped churches think intentionally about making pathways, like you said, back to the church?
Well, nothing transforms a culture like genuine relationships with people who are far from Christ. Whether those people come to the church or not, if we can encourage and train people to build relationships, intentionally build relationships, and be in environments where they're with people who are far from Christ and really listen to them and understand their perspective, their worldview, man, that does wonders to transform the culture of a church to say, wow, I never thought about that. My good friend Pat, who I talk about in the lab a lot, he is not a Christian. His wife gets into our church, so he's a regular part of it. But after about 3 years of attending our church, he said to me, "Kris, I got to tell you, I don't hate church anymore." And it was like, wow, that was just it was so encouraging to me, but at the same time, it's like, man, you've come a long way. What's going on in your head when it comes to church, and how do we begin to shape ministry in a way that addresses some of those concerns or those misconceptions about what church is? And if you can get more and more people in the church to have those kind of relationships, it really begins to change their thinking about what's important and what's a priority in the church. So hopefully that answered your question.
Yeah, I'm thinking too about, like, I was just at a church this past week that has a ministry. It sits right next to a big high school, and they have an intentional ministry effort where they welcome kids come over from the high school during the lunch break to hang out, get snacks, whatever. And the church is very explicit that they said, like, we're not expecting, immediate attendance in youth group or Sunday morning. Like they said, we recognize this is a long game. So how much is that important, Larry, just to set maybe realistic expectations? Like, I mean, gosh, Kris, 3 years and 3 years.
Yeah.
I think, sorry about that. I had a little interruption on my computer. A couple of things come to my mind. One is that when churches talk about bridging back into the church, my first thought about that is we bridge people back into the church, not for something that we're getting or getting their attendance or getting their time or getting their money. We're bridging them back into the church because the church has good news and good life.
Yeah.
Right. And so when we talk to people, what we want to be able to say is we invite you in, not because, in a sense, we need you here. We need your money or your time.
Right.
But we believe this is a place of life.
Right.
And we want to make sure that you find this place of life. And Kris has this in his congregation. One of the congregations that I served had this, but we have had a strong recovery ministry, right? And we could literally say in our church, there are people alive today that wouldn't be because they're part of that recovery ministry. And as they became part of that recovery ministry and they found life there, they also began to find life in the church.
Yeah.
And so I really want to say, for those high school kids, no, we're not trying to get you here because we want your bodies in pew, right?
Right.
We want you here because this is a place of life.
Yeah.
And so part of the work of the congregation is to make sure that it's a place of life, and that it becomes a draw because of that life, rather than saying, "Oh, you ought to be here, but there's no life here."
Yeah, I'll say this because this is my podcast and I can offend my listeners, who, I tend to have a lot of folks on the mainline side, and the mainline, there are certainly some liberal sides to the mainline. And I think this can be a challenge, is that there's a doubt of whether the church has life. I'll just be frank. So I think, like, that's hard, that's going to be hard to overcome, especially because inevitably when that is doubted, it becomes the first part, what you said, it's because we need you. Like, we need you to prop up our dying institution, which never works. So, I want to clarify, I want to emphasize that. But I think that's such an important point, is like, if you don't really believe that you have something to offer, like, it's not going to work.
Yeah. And that takes me to one of the challenges I thought of that I think a lot of churches face is that they're more eager to survive for the mission than they are to die for the mission. And that's a struggle. It's a tension that we deal with people, and we try to get to that place where we want to do whatever it takes to bring the gospel to our community. And if that means our death, so be it. But that's not an easy place to get to.
Yeah, because, like, I'm sure you all see this all the time, where inevitably the unstated mission becomes just survival. Like, it's not like we're trying to share the gospel or reach our community, whatever. It's just like survival is the mission.
Yeah.
Which certainly is not helpful or healthy for anybody. I'm curious about this, Kris. Like, where do you see churches most often misdiagnosing their problem. So, I mean, certainly there's some like lag measures, to use that word, I would think. Like attendance is a lag measure, lack of leadership is a lag measure. But like I'm convinced it's probably more lead measures. What do you see like what churches, they're pointing the wrong thing as a problem, I guess is what I'm saying.
Yeah. I think it is so easy for a church to have no indication that we're making disciples. And yet we have good attendance, we have good finances, we have good worship on the weekends, and yet we can look back at our history and there's no evidence that we're making more and better disciples. And that's part of our mission statement at the Center for Church Renewal is we want to help churches be intentionally, missionally, and make more and better disciples that transform lives and communities for Christ. And I think it's amazing to me, even in my own ministry, I've spent a lot of years measuring the wrong things.
Yeah.
And like you said, we use that language of leading and lagging indicators in the Renewal Lab. And I think we try to help churches say, let's measure the right things. How are we raising up more? So we're adding, new people to the kingdom who were far from God. So we're adding more, but we're also bringing people deeper. And that's one of the things that COVID just exposed in the Western church, right? Is that all of a sudden we cut millions of people from the church who said, I guess I don't need church.
Yeah.
And it was so clear that we are focusing on the wrong things. And so we try to say discipleship and growing people deeper, more and deeper is the center. And how do we measure that? And we try to help give churches tools so they know, are we making more and better disciples?
Larry, let's stay on this discipleship thing because this is something that I've been thinking about even more generally. Like I saw this, I'm trying to pull it up on my phone. I saw this tweet or post. Gosh. Oh yeah, here it is. And as someone was saying, again, the bugaboo of church attendance, you guys probably encounter this all the time, travel sports. And I want you to listen to this. This guy gives some bullet points about travel sports. Guaranteed family time every weekend. Tour the entire country, see the sights. Kids gain athletic skills and priceless memories. Chance at scholarships. Kids stay out of trouble. Make friends with people in town. And he says, this is supposed to be quote unquote bad, asking a question. And I just thought, wow, is that not just so perfectly summarized that more and more families are looking at other things to form or disciple their kids?
Yeah, we had that a lot as I was pastoring. Right, we were kind of at the front end of that whole movement, which has gotten more and more over the years. And one of my fellow pastors on staff would say to me, he was a guy who got a scholarship playing basketball and all that kind of stuff, and he said, they could talk all they want about scholarships. You know how many of those kids are actually going to get a scholarship? And so it's a little bit of an excuse, but I think, one of the things the church has to figure out is we can say what we want. Families are going to do what they're going to do.
Mm-hmm.
And so in that context, how do we disciple people who are there intermittently and kids who are there intermittently?
Yeah.
There's a book called Imagine Church, and he talks about recognizing that when we're at work, God wants to disciple us at work.
Mm-hmm.
And he begins to talk about how do we work that? How do we think with people in their jobs towards discipleship?
Right.
And I would say that if we're going to wisely live into this reality, we're not going to shame people probably out of it, right?
Right.
So how do we then begin to say, so how do we disciple families that are living that reality? Because we're not going to force them to change, But just like we start talking about, well, your work is a place of discipleship. So if your weekend's a place of discipleship and you're gone 20 weekends a year, how do we disciple you and disciple your kids in that context? And that calls for, a whole different way of us looking at this. And you know this as well, Loren, but most people now, if they show up at church once out of 6 weeks, they say, you know what, I'm a member of that church. I'm faithful, right? And, in years past, in Kris and my tradition, it was Sunday morning and Sunday evening, right? And then you had oncers, right? And they just came once a week. And now it's once every 6 weeks. And so we have a whole different pathway that we have to think about when it comes to discipleship and how we work in the realities that we're doing ministry in. And sometimes I think we always tried to battle against that. And I think eventually we said, we're not going to win that one. So how do we do this differently?
Yeah. First of all, as someone who grew up Independent Baptist and had evening church on Sundays, I'm thrilled to hear was not the only one. Like, who else? What other tradition did that? So I guess you all. I want to ask about, Kris, like, what's the biggest thing? Because I think this is so often what happens in struggling churches or churches seeking renewal, is just like, it just becomes like let's throw some things at the wall and see what sticks. How do you move from trying new things to actual transformation in culture and identity?
Yeah. Well, we do encourage them to try new things, but at the core of what we encourage is that the gospel is at the center of everything. So it's not innovation for the sake of innovation. It's innovation for the sake of the gospel. And that we really begin with helping them understand, how do we put the gospel at the center of everything? In our preaching, in our relationships with people, in our discipleship, how does that shape who we are? And so that the forms, whatever the forms might take, whatever program or idea we might have, that it's grounded firmly in the gospel. And in some ways that sounds, we're rediscovering the first love, as John would say in Revelation, right? It's like you've held on to, you've not forgotten your first love. And that is the gospel at the heart of everything. And I think it's amazing to me that everybody knows that, I think. At least most of the churches that we work with, I think that's not surprising to them, but it's how they apply that and how that really looks on a practical basis. There's some real transformation that we see happen in the lives of leaders and elders and deacons that come alongside the point leader, because we work with both in the Renewal Lab. So, just bringing them back to that core piece, I think, is really a huge part of what we do.
Larry, let's stay on this. I'm thinking about, oftentimes I've seen where a church wants to try this big sort of moonshot thing, and I think there can kind of be this sense that a struggling church will try something big and bold, and it doesn't succeed, doesn't land, and then they're even more reticent to try something again in the future. So, like, practically speaking, what does your suggestions look like for churches and trying new things?
So we do a couple of things. We talk about creating a healthy church culture, which is a culture of grace and permission, that we treat each other with grace that God and Christ treat us with, but also a culture of permission where we are permitted to try new things and fail at them. But we also, probably more, connected to that, but we talk about short-term wins. So we don't talk about moonshots. We talk about building a number of short-term wins that give people confidence that they can try new things, and some of those things will work and some of those things won't work. But it's not the end of the world because they haven't done a moonshot.
Yeah.
One example of this is that we were working with a church that wanted to increase their hospitality. They served pour coffee back in a fellowship room. You had to walk to the front of the sanctuary through a single door to get into. It's very intimidating for guests in particular. And they said, we're going to serve better coffee and we're going to serve it in the narthex. well, that's just a little thing, right? It cost them a couple $100 to do better coffee and so on. But for them, for the congregation, they said, oh, something's changed. Something's happening. We had another church that said, we're going to invite our neighbors to come at Christmas time and just decorate the trees outside our church. And we'll have hot chocolate and cookies and that kind of stuff. And so we don't say shoot for the moon. We say find some short-term wins that build some confidence, that if they fail, you can say we're a place of grace and permission. If they go well, you can say let's celebrate. So we're more incremental rather than shoot for the moon kind of people.
Yeah, I want to stay on this culture of grace and permission, especially the permission part, because I imagine, I'm making assumptions here, but I imagine in churches you work with that have been around for a while, or like many churches that I'm familiar with, been around for a while, like a lot of like committees and structure and complicated processes for like traditionally running things through to make things happen. Like, is a restructuring or a reallocating of like permission giving, like what does that look like? What do you advise churches to do for that?
We actually spend one entire session of our lab talking about structures.
Yeah.
And right. And talking about what makes for healthy structures, what makes for permission-giving structures, what size is a good size for your board, right? A lot of people think the bigger the board, the better the board. And our response is, no, the smaller the board, usually the better the board, right?
Yeah.
And so we do spend time walking through that and encouraging along the pathway from the very first moment for leadership to go back to the church and start talking about becoming a permission-giving community and structuring themselves so that permission can happen. And we know that's a real struggle. We had somebody walk into our church a number of years ago. We were building something out, and the guy said, that looks like a really great thing. What did it take to have that done? And I said, well, it was in the budget, and we built it out. He said, that would have taken 3 committees in 5 months at my place, right?
Yeah.
And I said, wow. I said, that's a structure that isn't going to be a very healthy one for you to be able to move forward. So we try to work as best we can with congregations to think about their structures to be able to move them forward in a place of vitality.
Okay. Kris, I got to ask this then, because I'm thinking of a conversation I had so I'm ordained in the Christian Church Disciples of Christ, and I had a conversation with one of my fellow colleagues in the tradition, Jared Longbonds, and he used these words like, and it's hard to argue, like our denomination, speaking for Jared and I, is not structured for growth. Like it's just not, because like you said, the structures and the polity and the governance is just, I hate to use the word backwards, but it's meant for another time, right?
Mm-hmm.
So Kris, what is thinking about the unique specifics of CRC and RCA, whether it's theological, whether it's historical governance practices, because this is like, again, in my tradition, the disciples, this is something I hear over and over again, where it's like, oh, we can't do that. Like that's not disciple. That's not our tradition. So certainly, like there's some institutional friction, inertia. Because I think this is something many traditions wrestle with. So, Kris, how do you help churches overcome that when it's like, oh no, we can't do this. This is not us.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a great question, Loren. I think we try to hold up examples, of what it looks like when structure is designed for function, and for mission. And I think we also acknowledge the challenge that a lot of leaders face, that is not going to be an easy thing to all of a sudden change their structure. And we acknowledge that our polity does not lend itself to that kind of change. As you said already, even though, we in our Reformed tradition acknowledge, hey, polity is changing all the time. We want it to be helpful. And ordinarily is a word we use a lot in our church polity. And yet, it's as much the history and the way we've always done things that hold people in that place of we have to do it this way in terms of structure. So you're not only fighting church polity that was designed, as you said, ours too, for another age and
Right.
for a certain size, for a
Yep.
certain size church. And so it's an uphill battle to try and help churches see a different vision for what a missional structure looks like. Because we often say to them, structure doesn't promote mission, but it will kill it. It doesn't generate missional thinking, but it'll kill missional thinking. So we try to give them good models of what that looks like when structures are designed for mission.
Yeah,
And
because
if I can just throw something
go ahead.
more too.
Yep.
We also talk to church leaders about things that their people need through a change process. And I'm playing from memory, so maybe Kris can help me a little bit here. But, we talk about things like they need to know that you care about them.
Yeah.
So as the process goes on, they need to know that you care about them. They need to know that certain things won't change, that there are core things in the life of the congregation that won't change, right? And so the gospel will be preached. In our tradition, the creeds and confessions will still be there. So there's some stability in the mix of change. They need to know that there's hope. So you need to be a person of hope. So you can say to them, we talk about, you can't stay here, but we can go here. So there's hope, right? And so one of the things we want leaders to be able to do is to know what they need as leaders as they step into a change process, what things their congregation are going to need in order for that change process to go forward. So congregations that feel left behind, put out, ignored, whatever it may be.
And I think when churches understand the why, that it's not just changing our structure because we need a more modern, it's really about the mission. Then I think we see leaders really step up and say, okay, we need to get serious about making some changes because it's going to make a difference for the kingdom.
Okay, this is not really off topic, but I got to ask for curiosity. Like, what's the craziest church structure you've seen? Like, I can't remember which context I saw this in or read about this, but I remember reading about one church where, like, I think it was like an elder-based structure, but elders, like, they would transition off being an elder, but then they could reactivate for a lifetime, like their eldership to come on and vote, which was just, who could ever see that being a problem? I mean, so for maybe help some listeners or pastors commiserate that theirs actually is not the worst. Like, what is the craziest structure you have seen?
So I'm not sure if it's the craziest one I've ever seen, but one of the things we experience is that churches hold on to the structure they had when they were 200 and now they're 100, or they're 75,
or they're 50,
or they're 50. And so one of the churches we were working with had an elder board and then a pastoral care elder board. And they had about 60 people left at worship. And their pastoral care elder board was 15 people. And their regular board was 10 people, right? And so they had 25 people involved in this leadership structure. It was just insane because, how do you get anything else done in the church? First of all, when you got 25 people, how do you get enough people to even fill those positions?
Right.
And it was just a completely broken structure. And, but they had been 500 at one point. And so they structured themselves for 500. And one of the things we talk about is, structure yourself for the size you are, maybe one size larger. But that was one of the crazier structures I've seen.
I'm curious, do you, like, I gotta imagine, like, once you're able to kind of help these leaders process through and grasp the change that you're offering, that there can almost be like a sigh of relief. Because to me, like, there's nothing more exhausting or even like energy sucking than just, especially for a new person who's like engaged in the church and wants to be a part of it, and then it's like, oh, go sit in committee meetings for 3 nights a week kind of thing.
Yeah. So, but one of the things, again, Kris and I are both church planters. So Kris planted in Indiana, I planted in Michigan, and we had the gift of creating our own structures to a certain extent. And so the structure that we created at the church I was at had no committees.
Yeah.
That turned out to be in many ways largely a gift. But at the same time, we started talking to our staff and saying, you don't have a committee, but you need advisors. You need to hear from the voice of the congregation, right? So you don't have to create a committee around education, but you should have a few people out there who you can listen to and trust their voice in that area of education. But too many churches, I think it was Rick Warren who said, we have a staff that administers so people can minister.
Yeah.
And so our goal was always to say, how can we slim down the administration enough so that people are opened up for ministry?
Kris, I think what Larry shared there about having not necessarily an education committee, but trusted advisors, even informally, is a great point. Any other good kind of tips you'd add there relatedly?
Yeah, I think one of the biggest challenges in our structure is that there's this attitude that the pastor is the employee of the council.
Yeah.
And there's truth to that, and there should be accountability for the pastor, but there needs to be a leader. And I think in our structure in the CRC, and maybe to a lesser extent in the RCA, but also there's this attitude of, you work for us. You're here for a short time. We're going to be here long after you're gone.
Right.
And I've heard of pastors' horror stories of being denied they put in for vacation. Nope, that's a bad time. You can't go then. You can't go to that conference. It's like, wow, but that's just a small symptom of the problem of leaders are not allowed to lead.
Mm.
And I think they're given all of the responsibility and none of the authority.
Yeah.
That is a huge challenge when it comes to structure. If you've got tons of responsibility but no authority, that is a remedy for disaster.
Yeah, burnout and dissatisfaction, I mean, at minimum for the pastoral leader. So, Kris, let me start with you here, and then Larry, you can follow up too. Like, what is one truth that about Church Renewal that either a pastor doesn't want to hear or the congregation does not want to hear?
Yeah, I think one of our teaching team, Pastor Scott Vanderplug, who also designed a discipleship process called 222 Disciple that we use as a really good model in our lab that really measures discipleship. But I think it's difficult to hear. You have to go slow to go fast. In other words, you're going to have to make significant investments in the community and your relationships in the community to build a missional heart for yourself and for the church. And you don't see a lot of dividends from that. You can, but it's slow going. When you're building relationships with people in the community, it's going to be a slow journey for that to bring people to church. And the same is true for discipling people that are a part of your church. That's a slow process. But if you're able to build into an individual, multiple individuals as a pastor, and you disciple people who then in turn disciple others, that's going to pay dividends in the long run. But it's gonna be a slow process, and none of us want to go slow, right? It's a microwave culture.
Yeah, that's good. That's good. Larry, how about you?
Yeah, and I'm going to play off this just a little bit, because one of the things we say to churches is 1,000 days to renewal. And the idea there is that to shift your culture, to begin to think differently, to change that structure, all those pieces, it takes at least 1,000 days. And our process is about a 2-year process. And so we say to people, when you're done with us, you still have 300 to 400 more days to go. And most churches, as Kris is saying, it's a microwave culture. They want to say, well, if we're going to renew like in, 6 to 8 months, right? And everything's going to turn around and things are going to go great and all that kind of stuff. And we say, no, this is a long, obedience in the same direction. And most churches don't want to hear that. And most pastors don't want to hear that. And I think leaders, as they go through this process, start getting pushback because people saying, you've been doing this for 8 months now. Where are the new people? Why why don't we have, 73 new families and all that kind of stuff? And one of our responses to them often is, how long did it take you to get here?
Yeah.
Right? 30 years, 40 years, 50 years that brought you to this space, and you want to get out of it in 5 months. That's not how this works. And so you need to have patience to continue the process for that 1,000 days and actually beyond those 1,000 days. So that's one of the hardest things. It really is. You've got to go slow to go fast. And I think it's really difficult for pastors and congregations to grab that.
So, 3 years, let me just say that, that's no joke. That's a legitimate length of time. So, Kris, I've got to ask, and certainly, Larry, you're welcome to chime in here too. How often do you find churches connecting with you, wanting help, when it's just, I don't want to say too late, because let's be frank, we believe nothing is ever, with God, nothing is impossible, right? But also, I'm sure you encountered that, right? Where there's 8 people left and no money in the bank.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm working with a church in Homewood right now that it's a Mennonite church that is facing some of that reality in terms of finances and numbers. And yeah, that's not an easy hill to climb. I don't want to sugarcoat that in any way, but I think there is a hopefulness. We also have what we call the Legacy Project as part of the Center for Church Renewal, where we help churches that are facing that unique challenge of, should we renew or should we, what we call, complete and bless? In other words, how do we leverage what we have right now for the kingdom in the future? And Keith leads that, and it is it's a great ministry. And we've been able to come alongside a number of churches and not come to them and say, here's what you should do, but help them in a discernment process. We have what we call a congregational assessment tool. It's one of the first things you see when you come to our website. And it really helps churches assess, okay, here's where we're at. We've got great concern, but there's hope for the future. Or we're doing great, or we're at a score where it's like, maybe we should consider how we can complete and bless. So we try to walk with churches through that journey and have honest conversations with them to face the reality. That's one of the things we talk about in the Renewal Lab as well, is leaders need to define reality. What is the current reality?
Yeah.
Tell that story. And then the next one is, what's our default future? If nothing changes, what is our future? And then finally, what is our God preferred future? What does the future look like if we can implement renewal in this context? So, Larry, anything to add?
Yeah, I think that we find this all the time. Churches have waited too long. And one of the challenges that we have actually is recruiting churches into this process of renewal, because most of them say, well, it's not that bad yet, right? I guess we're doing okay. And then 18 months later, they're going, oh my, this is not good. We've got to do something. And the truth is that as we've gone through, these last 10, 12 years of being in this renewal process, is we've actually closed churches down in the middle of the Renewal Lab. So churches get to the point, they say, you know what? We are recognizing now that we can't go on. And so we've actually closed down some churches. One of our churches decided to be taken over by another church. And so the process also, kind of unintentionally, in the Renewal Lab, leaves some churches to just say, yeah, we see where we're really at, and it was too late.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, this is such a important and, complicated topic in some ways. Anything else that you'd want to share for churches or leaders out there going through wrestling with renewal, praying for renewal in their churches? Kris, let's start with you again.
Yeah, just piggybacking off what Larry said, we don't begin the Renewal Lab with jumping in saying, here's what you need to do in terms of mission, vision, values, setting goals, strategic planning. We begin with, let's start with listening. Right? Let's listen, and we give them some practices that they can do to listen to God through Scripture and through prayer. But we also say, let's listen to our community. let's do some interviews with folks in our community that know our community well, teachers, law enforcement, community leaders, and let's hear and let's see as we listen to the community what bubbles up in that process. And also, we say let's listen to our people that are in our church. So we
Yeah.
we call it 4 directional listening, and a lot of churches and leaders don't want to take the time to do that, right? Let's jump to what we need to do.
Hmm.
And we try to, say to them, it's vital that we take the time to listen first and then see where God leads.
Yeah. Larry?
I think one of the things it's helpful for churches to do, and that I really want to encourage churches to do, is to, as Chris said earlier, to name the present reality. And one of the ways that we do that is we use something called the church life cycle, which you've probably seen, Loren, right? But for churches to see in that life cycle where they are so they know they need to act now. And the reality is, in that church life cycle, before you head over the top and start going down the side, when you're at the top is the time you start thinking about renewal. If you're already down the side, you've got a lot of work to do. And we say it's kind of like, when a rocket takes off, it takes all kinds of energy to go, but once it gets going, it's okay. But if it starts coming down again, it needs a whole lot of energy to get back going.
Yep.
And so one of the things I'd say to pastors and to church leaders is, have you checked your church life cycle? Because that's going to tell you where you are and where you need to be going and some next steps to take.
Well, this is great conversation. I appreciate y'all's wisdom and insights here. Let's take a quick break and we'll come back with some closing questions. All right, we're back with Kris Voss and Larry Doornbos. So thanks for this conversation. All right, some closing questions. We always tell folks you can take as seriously or not as you'd like to. Kris will start. If you're Pope for a day, and again, you can take this seriously or not as you'd like to, what would you want to do with that day?
Well, I think for me, I'm going to take it seriously. I'm going to say we're going to die on the hill of church planting and church renewal.
Okay.
And I say that in the midst of a little bit of frustration in the CRC, where we've recently, our agency's made a decision to cut funding for church planting. Not funding for the staff in that agency, but funding for new church plants. And it's like, man, for me, I just want to, let's cut everything but that.
Yeah.
And so that would be mine. That would be my papal decree.
Yeah. Larry, how about you?
I think if our Pope for a day, I'd want to have churches grab a vision of full orbed ministry. I think sometimes, at least in the context that Kris and I work in, it becomes a ministry of, how do we get either we're going to talk fire insurance or a pass into heaven.
Mm-hmm.
And I want to see, how do we help people imagine a full orbed ministry that touches issues of, life for people, justice in the world, hope in the world. How do we make our communities places of life rather than just places of fire insurance?
Love it. Yeah. Okay. Theologian or historical Christian figure you'd want to meet or bring back to life?
St. Patrick has always been one of my favorites.
Okay.
I mean, what a story. A guy enslaved, and then God calls him to go to the people that had enslaved him. And he's one of the only missionaries in history that we know that transformed a whole people group. And so I would love to sit down and have a conversation with St. Patrick.
I would love to talk to George MacDonald, who was one of the precursors of C.S. Lewis and others, and the way that he thought and wrote. I'm just intrigued by that. And so I'd love to sit down with George MacDonald.
Yeah. I don't think I've ever gotten any of those or either of those. So this is good. What do you think history will remember from our current time and place?
I think it's a time in history when the church had an incredible opportunity for influence, and instead it is withering. And that's not, that's, I guess, just our time in recent history that we're seeing decline when we had incredible status and influence, and that is withered. And I think nationalism is going to play a part in that too. When people look back on history, how nationalism had such a significant role in the church, and with devastating effects.
Yeah.
But a remnant rose from the ashes.
Yeah, I think about Phyllis Tickle and how she talks about the shift every, I think it's 500 years of what the church is and what it does. And I think that this, she saw this as a tipping point in what she wrote. And I wonder that as well. What will this moment be as a tipping point, as Kris is talking about, churches that have kind of given themselves over to a Christian nationalism and to that pathway, and kind of sold themselves out to get power. And how will this become a tipping point where there's maybe even a divergence in the church between a church that says we're after power and a church says no, we're after the good news of life-giving communities.
Yeah. What do you hope then for the future of Christianity?
For me, first thing, I mean, you've heard it a number of times in our conversation, but renewed discipleship.
Yeah.
I think that the local church would have a clear and intentional understanding of what biblical discipleship looks like, and that we would live into that and lean into it.
So to play off just a little bit, I think one of the things we talk about in our context is restoring the practices of the early church from Acts 2. And I would love to see a church that reflects that Acts 2, 42 through 47 context. And then we also talk about the passage in Luke where Jesus says, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me." And so I would love to see a future of Christianity that reflects the practices of Acts 2 and the ministry call of Jesus in Luke 4.
Yeah. Great. Well, share how folks can get in touch with the center and connect with you all. Share all that.
churchrenew.org. That is our website, and you can find everything that we do at the Center for Church Renewal at churchrenew.org. And I know, Loren, you're a fan of Andy Root. So we have Andrew Root coming to our Church Now Cafe in Holland, Michigan, coming up in August. This will be, Larry, I think our third time hosting Andy.
Fourth? Yeah.
So we've got so much out of those Church Now Cafe conferences that we have in West Michigan. And I should let Larry say that because he knows Andy better than I do.
I was just going to say, every time Andy comes out with a new book, we have him in for a conference. That's kind of what it comes down to. And so his latest book on evangelism has just really captivated us. And so he's going to come in and talk about that. And we call Church Now Conversations or Church Cafe because Andy does some talking, but then we have church leaders gathered around tables and they have conversations about how to implement that or how to have those ideas come into the life of the congregation. So that's there. And the other thing I'd like to just mention, Loren, is that we have a Lilly grant that allows us to work with Native American Latino congregations. And sometimes those congregations sit a little bit outside the renewal process. They don't have the resources and so on. And so Lilly grant allows us to engage those congregations. And at the same time, for us, it's a learning process because we've worked largely with Anglo congregations over the last 12 years. So they're teaching us and we're learning and we're teaching them. And it's a wonderful, wonderful space. And so if there are congregations that are out there that are either Latino or Native American interested in the renewal process, again, churchrenew.org, they can find us, but we'd love to have a conversation with them.
Okay, I have to ask then. Sorry to cut you off, Kris. I have to ask then. I'm trying to get Andy on for his latest book again. So if you talk to Andy Root, tell him I'm he is his email sitting in his inbox from me, trying to get another one scheduled. But seriously, I do want to ask this, even though we're running along on time. So I want to ask this. In your work with, what do you think your Anglo congregations could most learn from your from these non-Anglo congregations that you've worked with?
One of the things that comes to mind with the Native Americans especially is a more of a storytelling structure, that it's a non-linear. We're so steeped in Western culture in a linear, okay, we do this, we get this. And I think the relationships and the storytelling culture and Larry did a great redesign of some of our material based more on a storytelling culture. And that's been really a beautiful thing for us and helping us reshape some of what we're doing with Anglo churches.
Yeah, and I would add to that, both in the Native American and Latino cultures, one of the surprising things to us is that we go and we speak and talk to them and say, would you like to join? And for the most part, their answer is yes, right? And we say, well, don't you have to run it through, these, 27 committees to get you to this place? And they're going, no, we want to be part. And so one of the things I'd like to say that, at least in the recruitment phase, is that what Anglo churches can learn is to be a whole lot more willing to jump in and participate in a renewal process, like these other churches are in their willingness.
Yeah. Well, this has been a great conversation. I appreciate your time. And we always leave folks with a word of peace. So may God's peace be with you.
Thanks for joining us on the Future Christian Podcast. The Future Christian Podcast is produced by Resonate Media. We love to hear from our listeners with questions, comments, and ideas for future episodes. Visit our website at future-christian.com and find the Connect with Us form at the bottom of the page to get in touch with Martha or Loren. But before you go, do us a favor. Subscribe to the pod to leave a review. It really helps us get this out to more people. Thanks, and go in peace.